You're listening to episode 39 of the Confident Rider podcast with Jane Pike. Elsa Sinclair is my most fabulous guest with me today, who I'm very excited to have join me. I've been following Elsa for, feels like a really long time now. And last year at Equidays, we met in person, which was really exciting for me. I still remember seeing you pop up in the car park and doing a little happy dance in my car. Welcome, Elsa. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much, Jane. I'm really happy to be chatting with you today. It feels like it's forever ago since we hung out at Equidays, and
Right?
I wish we lived closer to each other.
Oh, so do I. I know. It really sparks in me the commune idea that was with me many years ago, where I'm like, maybe I could just scoop all of these amazing people into one area and we can have these conversations every day.
We just have to make use of technology more in situations like this.
A virtual commune. Maybe commune's not the right word, but it kind of like takes me to that place.
Community.
Yeah, beautiful community. So kicking off with what it is you are doing, the work you're doing, and all of the beautiful magic that you're bringing to the world with your horses. You started with Taming Wild, the movie. Is that kind of the first professional entry into what it is you're doing now, or the first segue? Do you want to take us back to that and kind of talk about how you got started with what you're doing?
Sure. I'm actually third generation horse trainer. So horse training runs in my family, and I've been doing it forever. But Taming Wild, the film, was really the beginning of something unique and different.
Yes. Thank you for clarifying that. That's what I meant, into like the freedom-based training approach. Yeah.
So it was actually a challenge laid out for me by a student. She said, if you took a wild horse who had never had any form of pressure put on it, and you didn't use any food rewards or any tools, would that horse ever want you to ride it? Mm-hmm. And I thought that was probably a question that had never really been asked. And if nobody had ever asked the question, maybe I should. And so I ended up doing a project and filming it. And it was sort of many years in the making, because between the process of filming it and making it, I had to fundraise and make money and all of those good things and raise a child and
technicalities thrown in there.
But it was sort of my first foray into doing something really sort of different and unique. And I thought it would be just a novelty in the horse world, and it ended up taking off. There were a lot of people who were really interested. Mm-hmm. And since then, it's become my entire career. It's all I teach now.
I love that so much. So when you mentioned this segue moment, this kind of like intermediary moment between having this spark of inspiration and actually getting to the formative stages of making the movie, and also coming from what was, I can only assume, a kind of more traditional approach to horse training and working with horses. So within that space, were you simultaneously thinking, how am I going to do this? Like, what will this look like? How will this take shape? Because it's quite challenging to step outside the box, even if you're trying to, if you don't have any role model or someone there saying, I'll do this or play with this. So it's very playful in and of itself, experimental.
It is, yes. And I was a fairly traditional trainer, and my theory was to use everything that I knew, but break it into smaller pieces, mm-hmm. so that the progress was in bite-sized pieces. So if I had no food rewards and no tools to pressure a horse into learning things, how small would I have to break each piece down for the horse to follow their own natural interest and curiosity into learning the next piece of the puzzle? Mm-hmm. And I learned so much about that. But there were, a lot of nights where I curled up in the hay trough and she ate hay next to me, and I cried my eyes out because I had no idea how to break this piece into anything smaller than what I knew. Mm-hmm. But eventually, you cry over it enough nights and you dream over it enough nights, you come up with another way to break it down. And if you break it into small enough pieces, the horses are naturally curious and interested.
Yeah. Yeah, such a beautiful and difficult and torturous and amazing process to go through. Especially, I imagine, losing the natural time frames that we put on ourselves, or the expectations that we have about producing a result, and what even that result would look like.
Yeah. I gave myself 1 year to film the movie.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people said, oh, you're never going to get that done in a year. And I said, yeah, but I'm going to go crazy if I think it's going to take me 10 years. So we're going to do 1 year and see what happens. And it actually ended up going a lot faster than many people anticipated.
Can you remember the first thing that was like, I think I'm getting somewhere? Like, was there a moment where you, in between the crying in the manger, it's like, this is it. This is what I'm in it for. Like, was there a moment, or was it more just a series of things that happened that created this different atmosphere?
So I think the turning point where I really felt like I was getting somewhere was when I started opening the gates and taking Myrna out for walks on the neighbor's property. And, we had no fences to enclose us, and realizing that she really was going to stay with me. She had no desire to run off or run home to her friends. She wanted to be with me, and she wanted to go explore things. And if we came across something she'd never seen before, like the neighbor walking a dog, she would let me guide her to a safe place or turn the other direction, or keep her in her comfort zone enough that she felt safe being out there, meeting new things and seeing new things. And that really felt like where we started to make progress, and I thought we were really doing something.
Yeah, that's pretty special. Those moments are pretty special. To fill in some blanks for people who might be kind of feeling like we're a few steps ahead, Myrna is the Mustang that you adopted for the purposes of going through this process with a horse. And she was a blank slate, essentially, when she came to you. So everything that you were doing together was from point zero in terms of horse-human interaction.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And the freedom-based training technique, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
So freedom-based training is just this idea that if we train a horse without any use of tools or food rewards, they have the freedom to let us know how comfortable it is for them. If it's uncomfortable, they simply walk away. There's nothing stopping them from walking away. And what that does is it really tasks us to develop feel and timing beyond the normal amount we have to have as horse trainers. And we really learn how to develop training within the comfort zone of the horse.
Yes, I love that. So as someone that has participated in one of your courses, what really struck me, well, actually so many things struck me, I don't even know really where to start, but one of the key elements that stood out from the outset was how it was very much about where it is I am in this conversation with my horse, where it is that I am in relation to my horse and how that is causing them to feel, and then being able to interpret the subtle signals that really can be so subtle that indicate when we are losing good feeling between us, when we're losing that flow and harmony. And that was a real shift in perception from me focusing on them and perhaps moving towards either an idea of needing to do something or needing to complete something or just having them feel a certain way. And in the midst of that, kind of losing a connection with myself, if that makes sense. What you're talking about is really this dynamic of like me and you, how are we together? How do we shift? When do I leave? When do I come back? And it's just this beautiful synergy that's constantly in flow.
And what's amazing about it is how much learning and development horses really want to do. And that really has amazed me in the first film, and then again as we went into the second Taming Wild film as well.
Yeah, it's a natural, that desire for connection and for flow is inherent. It's not something that we cultivate. It's something that we kind of tap into if we have enough intuitive awareness about it.
Yeah, I would say some horses you need to cultivate it with. Just like people, they come in all different varieties. Some of them like harmony a lot more than others, and some of them are a little bit more conflict driven.
Yeah. What was really interesting, just as a personal experience, which is nothing sort of monumental but of great interest to me, was when I was working with my 3 in a herd situation, which I will throw in really challenged my patience and self-imposed parameters of like what I should be achieving and when. But Sausage, who is the youngest and perhaps least, she doesn't seem to listen as well as the others. Like she doesn't pick up on the cues. So things dissolve into a conflict fairly quickly with her because she hasn't picked up that perhaps she should move a little earlier. And I remember having this conversation with you and you saying that there was this possibility that existed in that moment for me to teach her to move away faster. And I know that seems like kind of a small thing to throw in there, but it was fascinating how we could consider ourselves to be part of this herd dynamic. And if we're able to pick up on what it is that they are offering us and communicating to us, that we can actually lead a horse. And I guess is that the basis of what you would call supportive or assertive leadership, being able to kind of make those decisions for the sake of both of us and move us towards better feeling places or places of safety?
You know, supportive and assertive leadership are just two different ways we can do that.
Mm-hmm.
Leadership in general is about making decisions and having someone else agree.
Mm-hmm.
So when you have a horse like Sausage who doesn't even notice that someone made a decision, let alone agree with it, we can do some different kinds of leadership to help her prick her ears up and go, oh, there's a decision happening here. Maybe I could agree with it or disagree with it, but paying attention would be good.
Yeah, that's so true. I'll pass that on. I'll pass that message on. So within the discussion, we have these two elements that you so eloquently describe as width and depth. And width is, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but these are sort of my rememberings of how you teach them. But the width is really about the ease that we can get our horses to do something. So it's very much skill-based. And
yes.
Depth is the friendship or relationship or the desire, I guess, that we have to be together.
The simple way that I usually put that is that width is all the things you can do together, but depth is how much you enjoy doing those things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Beautiful. And so within again, I'm sort of throwing around terminology, but like traditional paradigms of horse training that we might be the most familiar with, width is something that we're hyper-focused on, sometimes at the expense of depth. And with what you're offering, it's a flip of that coin. So we're coming in and saying, it's not that we don't want width at some point necessarily, but the depth is the first port that we're beginning this conversation at.
Yeah, when we have a round pen or a halter or something that holds the horse to us, or even if we carry all the cookies, anything that holds the horse to us means that the horse will often develop skills when we ask them to, even if they're not having a great time. But if you take away all those things, you have to build the depth first. They have to actually enjoy being with you before they'll even consider learning something new.
Yeah. And that's where the finesse in communication becomes so important, huh?
Absolutely. And what I've found is that when we take that depth first approach, it really develops the feel and timing of the person. And even if you then choose to do a more width-based approach later on, you understand what you're seeing so clearly with the horses. And it's really fun to watch my students develop their powers of perception, no matter what type of training they go on to do.
Yeah. So a good point of clarification actually to throw in at this stage is that we're not judging width or depth as like better or worse necessarily, because you can start from a place of building width and end up with a lot of depth in your relationship. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive if you start the other way around.
Absolutely.
But what you're offering is a different approach, a different way of coming about things and understandings that start with depth as the primary emphasis.
And actually what I would say is that horses that are trained width first, as in they learn how to do things and then they learn how to enjoy them later, they make progress much faster. And so if speed is necessary in a training regime, you want to use the right tools for the job. There's nothing wrong with that. If speed is of no matter to you, then people really learn deeply if they do a depth first kind of training.
Yeah. And so could you describe for us, my brain is spinning. I've got so many questions and I love these conversations, so I get very excitable. When we talk about the different modes of leadership, we have on the one hand passive leadership, and on the other end of the spectrum we have dominant leadership. And in between that there are, depending on how in depth you want to get into it. We have the middle ground, which is this assertive leadership, and then everything that would exist on either side to that. Passive leadership is something that I first heard about a few years ago, I think through Mark Rashid. When I was reading his books, this concept of passive leadership came up. But even at that point, I had an idea of what it is that he was talking about, and I could see through demonstration how a horse could lead through passive leadership, but how to develop that was a completely different conversation. And for me, you were the first person that's actually articulated and demonstrated how that could be possible. Are you happy to talk a little bit about those three areas and the flux between them?
Absolutely. So Mark Rashid was a huge inspiration for me when I started the first project. And I think that he's done amazing work inspiring people to look at the passive leadership in horse herds naturally. The way I define passive leadership is where you don't make decisions for someone else, you make decisions for yourself. So if you are a passive leader kind of horse, you decide you're thirsty and you walk to go get water. Now it's leadership because you've made a decision and the rest of the herd looks at you and goes, oh, what a great idea. I want water too. And they follow.
Yeah.
You haven't forced anyone else to do anything. You just did something for yourself, but you do it at a time in a way that makes everybody want to agree with you. And so as human beings, we are aiming to do this in freedom-based training. When I make decisions, I try and time them so that horses think, that is great. I want to do that with you also.
I love that. And so that would mean that in order for that to be the natural yes answer, you would have to be connected. There would have to be a degree of shared focus and harmony that existed between you for that decision to be noticed in the first place and then followed through on.
Yes. And so the thing that I believe passive leaders do is they invest in harmony with their herd. And so what I do when I'm developing my passive leadership is I stand on the left side of my horse or the right side of my horse. And I think, if I stay here, does this horse feel like it can harmonize with me? And if it does, it's agreed with my personal decision. And then I do that in as many different places and as many different ways as I can. Once we've established a habit of being in harmony with each other, then when I make a new decision, like going to get water or walking to the gate or walking to the bottom of the field, the horse is already in the habit and a pattern of being in harmony. And it's a natural evolution that they would want to do what I want to do.
That makes so much sense. What just popped into my mind, and I'm not sure if this is going to be useful or not, so we'll just flow with it and see what comes up. Do you think that in a herd situation, horses learn to be passive leaders? Do you think that's something that's facilitated through the constellation of the herd, or do you think there is a natural inclination within some horses to lead that way?
From what I've observed, and my observations are limited at this point, but from what I have seen, it's very often passed down from mother to foal. If you have a very dominant mare, her foal will usually mimic her behavior and become a very dominant horse. If you have a passive leader type mare, that foal is going to watch and mimic their mother's behavior and end up being that kind of horse as well.
Yeah. My husband, his older quarter horse had passed away now, but he was the perfect example of a passive leader. When you put him with the babies, there didn't seem to be anything that happened, but everyone just fell into line and everything was really harmonious. And since he's left, there's a huge hole in the herd because my younger horse tends to be the most dominant one, but he does it in quite a clunky way where I'm like, Dee, I think that was a little bit OTT. Like, I really don't think that was necessary to kind of affirm things in that way. So I was just interested to know, from what it is that you've observed, whether that's an inherited trait or, like you say, it completely makes sense that it comes through the mare and foal lineage. Yeah.
And what I find is that herds, they want harmony. And So very often, if you have really dominant members of the herd, the other horses will become very submissive so that you get sort of a black and white balance.
Yeah.
And it takes a very strong individual to walk in and say, I'm going to be a passive leader. I'm not going to fall into that role of being dominant or submissive. I'm going to do something different.
Yeah.
So I find those types of horses are actually fairly unusual and just a blessing to a herd when they arrive.
Yeah. Like, look at you go. I guess in the domestically constructed herd situation as well, like the numbers I'm talking about are 3 and 4, like very small numbers. Whereas if you were to compare that to a bigger herd situation, Mustangs or Brumbies and the likes, then you'd be having a much greater degree of variability between the different horses and how they sort of fill in the blanks for each other.
Yeah. Although I have the herds that I studied in Nevada for a little while, it was interesting to me because you could go 2 miles over the hill and meet a completely different family. So you would have one family that clearly was made up of a lot of passive leaders and they were very harmonious and easy. And 2 miles over the hill, you would have a herd that was made up of very dominant and submissive characters that fought all the time.
We are all much more similar than we think.
Yep.
It sounds like the basis of an excellent equestrian reality TV show.
Yes.
Oh, I find it fascinating. So moving on to what your most recent project has been, Pura Vida. Is that how I say it?
Pura Vida, yes.
Pura Vida. It's always these beautiful words that my Australian accent has trouble with. This is the movie that's just been released in December. Is that right?
Yes, it was just released. Yes, it was December that it was released. My goodness, it's been a whirlwind.
I can imagine. So talk to me about the idea behind that and what the actual movie embodies and captures for you.
Well, Andrea Wadey is a friend of mine. She lives in Costa Rica, and she invited me to come down and teach a clinic on freedom-based training after my first film.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was there, we had a great time. And she mentioned that she's always wanted to take a journey across the country of Costa Rica with horses. And then she turned to me and she said, do you want to do it with me? And I said, yeah, I think I do. And then life went on and we didn't talk about it for a while. And then we came back together and said, what about that thing that we talked about? And at this point, we had talked a lot about freedom-based training, and we wanted to bring the concepts of freedom-based training into a more realistic situation. So in the first film, I had the horse on my property and everything was very safe and I never had to put a halter on her. And, it was very sort of idealistic.
Mm-hmm.
But the question was, what if we were in a situation that was a little bit more familiar to people? And one of the things I run into is a lot of people rescue horses that have traumatic backgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
And then they want to know how to help them.
Yeah.
And so we thought, what if we rescue 2 horses from traumatic backgrounds and then we cross the country with them, training them as we travel, using every bit of freedom-based training that we can, while also keeping a halter and rope on them as we travel so we don't lose them into the jungle or let them get hurt or anything like that.
Yeah.
So it was basically the idea to take freedom-based training into a slightly more realistic setting of what other people might run into, but also put it into an adventure that would be fun to watch as a film, as a story.
It was super fun to watch. I was totally invested in it the whole way through. Do you think as well there's something inherently healing about movement, about that consistent movement for both horses and humans?
Yes. And that was the big push for the movie, was that movement lowers stress.
Mm-hmm.
And when stress is lowered, harmony and flow become natural for partners.
Mm-hmm.
So movement is one of the ways that we do that. When we share movement, we bond. And we wanted to build a bond with these horses that had never trusted people before.
Yeah. I think I remembered a book that I read a really long time ago, and I can't remember the title, but I think it's called Born to Run. And it talks about, have you read that book?
I have not read it, but it's very familiar to me. I feel like I've talked about it with people.
Yeah, so it talks about the origins of running and how actually as a species we are wired to run or to walk really long distances. And the author of the book, I could be completely getting this wrong, but just from my memory, went to Africa because there are a couple of tribes there that still exist that run masses of miles a day as just part of their everyday routine. And he looked into that, you know, how it is we are actually wired for movement and what that does to us and how it's important to us. And I think that just on a very cellular level, we've lost that in some ways through our sedentary lifestyle. And I guess horses have lost that too through the way that we've created, you know, life for both of us in order to fit into the modern way of going about things.
Yeah, I think that it's one of those things that's profoundly healthy for humans and horses.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also easily lost because as living beings, we tend to reach for easy solutions.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if it's not your cultural norm to move a lot, you tend to become sedentary. Most societies do, it seems. Even horses, if there's plenty of food, they don't tend to travel very far because food is right under their noses.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
And
the healthiest wild horse herds do live in situations where they travel huge amounts of distance.
yeah. And geographically, just with the way properties are fenced and tracks are, you know, for horses, not for horses, it's quite difficult to find that continuity of landscape where you can actually go and go and go.
Yeah. So we followed a trail across Costa Rica called the Camino de Costa Rica. And it literally is a trail from coast to coast. And you can hire a guide to show you how to get from one coast to the other, traveling through the most incredible terrain.
It looked beautiful, like quite treacherous in some parts too. Like some of those slopes were not for the faint-hearted.
Yes, and that is an interesting thing. The trail was designed for people, not horses.
Yes.
And so our guide was wonderful, and he came up with alternate routes for us when it was things like crossing train trestles that the horses were not going to be able to cross, or, you know, walking along high logs across a river. We had to come up with alternate routes for the horses, and it was quite treacherous at times.
Yeah, some of those bridges as well. I was like, holy bridge, that looks like a swinger.
Yeah, poor Andrea is quite afraid of heights, and she was really challenged across some of those bridges, but it was amazing how well the horses trusted us.
Well, and she also did an excellent job then embodying her inner Zen, because I never would have got that impression from her crossing the bridge the way that she did.
Yeah, we all grew a lot on that journey, but it was interesting what life threw at us, and then what we had to sort of dig deep and find in ourselves to do it.
Yeah. So what came up for you, like with Apollo, your horse, he was, are we okay to throw in some spoilers here for people who haven't seen the movie?
Absolutely. Yeah. You know, it's a beautiful story, and no matter how many spoilers we throw in there, people are still going to want to see the connecting pieces that pull it all together.
Very true. Very true. So Apollo had quite a lot of fight in him, and in the beginning was very reluctant. It seemed to be touched, didn't like any kind of contact. He was more of a just leave me be over here.
Yeah.
In that
We
got
Apollo from the meat market. Mm-hmm. And Andrea went and bid against the meat packers for him, and she won the bid. And after she did, the locals were really kind, and they came over and they said, "Congratulations on your new horse. Please never try and ride him. He's very dangerous."
Wow.
And poor Andrea at that point called me and said, "I think I've made a terrible mistake." I said, no, don't worry. It's fine. If I just walk all the way across the country, I don't need to ride him. Mm-hmm. The point is to rehabilitate the relationship. Riding is a bonus if it happens, but it's not necessary.
Yeah. What made me say wow was not the story, but wow in contrast to having watched the movie. And then recently being in your group as well, seeing him, he was lying down eating some hay and kind of galloping through these luscious green meadows. Like, what a sliding doors moment for Apollo. That's just, the story progression is remarkable really from that place.
Yeah, it was. And that's the thing about the story, is sometimes people fault me on the fact that we don't have a lot of bad things that Apollo did. They wanted to see the contrast, you know, where's that dangerous horse? But from the moment we got him, we treated him with a different kind of respect that really was about not triggering that past story, but building a new one.
Yeah.
And so what you see in the movie is really all about building the new story, not about triggering the old one.
Yeah, you instantly offered him a new perspective and didn't buy into the previous patterns with ways that he would expect, huh?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, it was really difficult in the first couple of days. He had no bond with the other two horses, and they walked quite fast, and he had no desire to keep up. And if you put pressure on him, he stopped and ran backwards. So I was really at a loss, particularly because our guide said, we can't be out here at night when the snakes come out. You have to speed that horse up.
There is a high motivating factor right there.
And I didn't know how to speed him up. It seemed like an impossible task.
Do you
And so
attribute that to part of his trauma reaction? Like, do you notice, has there been a higher degree of bonding or, like integration with the other horses since he's rehabilitated, if we want to use that word? Or do you think it's just he's a naturally introverted type?
I think he is naturally introverted, but he did bond with them as we traveled. It was really just the first 3 days that were particularly rough. And I do think that whether humans built it into him or it was the way he was born, I don't know. But he was all fight and no flight. So it was very difficult to motivate him into movement when any pressure he felt, he just wanted to fight back.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a curious thing, trauma, isn't it? Like that I've studied it a lot and work with it a lot in my own work with riders, of course, and the parallels are really interesting where from my point of view, we're always looking to establish this corrective emotional experience. That's what I like to refer to it as. And the way to do that comes with lots of little changes in focus, which is what you're always trying to initiate as well, so that the natural consequence of trauma is this, not only this introversion where we become hyper-focused and zoomed in on the contractive experience of pain or suffering that we're feeling in response to a certain stimulus, that our focus at that point tends to zone in on the things that potentially might go wrong. So we have this very negatively geared association. And so if you can gently tweak and say, I get that you're feeling like that, but what about if I just remind you that there's actually something else that you can focus on? It could be just your hands, and it just allows you to sort of zoom out of that place for a moment. And then you can go back to it if you want. But then what if we think about this over here? And for you, when I saw you dancing on the path or like trying to motivate him or just ask for something different, a flick of the ear, a change in the eye, is that kind of a similar thing, do you think, in terms of the methodology?
Yes, absolutely. That is, what I was trying to do. We don't have words the way we can use with human beings, but I was trying to do that through body language. And so what would happen is Apollo would walk along with his ears hanging flat out to the sides like a mule, walking very slowly.
He had such an expressive face.
I would dance. I would dance back and forth across the trail. And actually, we don't have any footage of the first couple of days because I was experimenting and I didn't know if it would work. And I forgot to tell the film person that he needed to catch it. So we don't actually have any footage of that until the third day. In the beginning, I'm dancing back and forth on the trail. And when I would get a flick of an ear or some sort of change of focus, I would match him identically. I would walk as slow as he wanted to walk. I would mirror him so that harmony was the thing we had after he had a change of focus. And then after 3 or 4 breaths or 3 or 4 steps, I would start dancing again. And apparently Apollo didn't like my dancing very much because at some point he realized if he kept flicking his ears and changing focus, I would never start dancing.
He's like, give the girl a flick. Let's just flick those ears, even if you don't feel like it.
Yep. So he would flick those ears to keep me in harmony with him. And I would walk along like a turtle next to him. And what happened is when his ears started moving more and his focus started changing more, he started getting curious about what was around the next bend in the trail. And then he started speeding up of his own volition.
Wow, it's really remarkable, isn't it? When you go, it's like going down a rabbit hole that once you kind of get to a certain point along you realize that you can't actually ever go back to another way of doing things.
Yeah, it's when you start really sort of trying to motivate themselves? And how would I use the gentlest possible extrinsic motivation to tap them into their own personal motivation to do things? It gets really exciting. It's hard to go back to just motivating them to do what we want them to do.
Yeah. Yeah, because that the energy of connection is potent, I think. Like when you are engaged in relationship where you're actually mutually exchanging a conversation, there's something so enamoring about that it's intoxicating, I find.
It really is. I loved horse training from the time I was a child. I have never stopped loving it. But now that I'm working in this way with freedom-based training, the world that has opened up for me is so much more fun than it ever used to be.
Yeah. Yeah. So cool. And to think like that for both of you, like, so Zeus's background then, was he similar to Apollo in terms of, had he had a traumatic experience as well, or is it uncertain what exactly had happened?
We don't know exactly. We know he had scars from his bridle and he had scars from his saddle. We did not buy him from the meat market. Andrea actually said to me after she went that first time, she said, I can't go back. It's too horrible. I can't go back and buy another horse from there.
Yeah.
And I said, well, what are we going to do for the second horse? And she said, I know one that needs to be rescued. He's not getting fed enough. He's not getting watered enough. He's skin and bones and he needs to be rescued. And I'd like to rescue him. And so she did that. We don't really know what his history was other than he was very shut down and scarred and thin, very, very emaciated and thin. But they built the most incredible relationship and started a whole new story for him.
Yeah, it was a beautiful thing to see. And prior to actually setting off, they were turned out, I think, for 6 weeks, was it, that you said at the start of to get well enough to the point where you could contemplate doing what you did together?
Exactly. They had no interest in human beings. So for 6 weeks, they lived in a pasture and Andrea fed them every day and she put halters on to feed them and then took the halters off again, just to make sure that when we did the trek, we were able to put halters on them to, make sure that things stayed safe.
Yes.
But that was really all the training they had in their 6 weeks of rest between their past and then the journey we took together.
Wow. It always blows me away how gracious horses are, to think that they've come from a place that we can probably hardly imagine in terms of their treatment. And then to go in that shorter time frame. I mean, even 6 weeks is nothing, is it? It's like to be at the place where you're now walking across Costa Rica is quite the thing.
It is, although, really horses are naturally inclined to travel. It is, I think it's part of their natural makeup. So while they weren't really sure what we were doing in the first couple of days, it didn't take them very long before they settled into it and said, yes, this is good. This is easy. This feels natural.
Yeah. Yeah. So beautiful. Can we talk a little bit about the focus piece? Because that's something that personally I find really interesting, and I know kind of takes up quite a lot of conversations that you have in freedom-based training.
Yes.
But when we're looking to develop this harmony and develop this flow together with our horses, we're really wanting to, in the first instance, and again, feel free to correct me at any point, to end on better feelings. So to find these places where we're in harmony, but then to have the timing, which is really the thing, to be able to leave the situation by choice before that dissipates in some way.
Yes. The basic theory is that stress is always going up and it's always coming down. It's like a heartbeat. And when stress gets too high, you see results of fight or flight. And when stress is in a really functional place, you see results of harmony and collaboration. So if you do anything for too long, stress will rise to the point that someone needs to fight back or run away. And the key with the timing is to take each individual thing that we do and keep it within a reasonable time limit for the partners that are doing that thing.
Yeah.
So as simply as, if I stand on the left side of my horse, if I stand on the left side for too long, they're either going to walk away from me or they're going to take their head and they're going to bash it into me and knock me into a different position. if I can move to the right side before either of those things happen, the horse associates with me good decision-making skills. Mm-hmm. And the more they associate good decision-making skills with me, the better they feel about being in my company, the more their stress tends to stay in the functional zone, and the more likely harmony and ease are going to be between us. And it becomes a really positive cycle if we can get the timing right.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. For someone then in a position where they're going about things in a fairly functional way, and perhaps they haven't been exposed to thinking about some of the things that we're talking about now, what would you recommend as a good start point? What's a good way of kind of coming into this new learning and ways of going about things? Is there something they can do, or do you think it's really a whole new way of looking at things, huh?
You know, it's really very, very simple and logical when you wrap your head around it, but it's really different from what most horse training is. And so I have up on my YouTube channel, there's a Freedom-Based Training 101 where people can walk through my beginning exercises, follow the video along and see the basic theory. It's just the tip of the iceberg. But if you can get that tip of the iceberg and you can start observing and responding to the horse, it starts to show you all the little details that you might have been missing before.
Yeah, it's funny enough, one to watch.
People will often watch the webinar and then they'll contact me and they'll say, my horse still doesn't seem very connected to me. And I say, well, that's not really the point. The point is you are connected to your horse. You are earning their connection to you, and you haven't earned it yet.
Yeah.
You earn it by showing the horse how much you see them and how much you can respond to them and what your feel and timing is around them.
Yeah. And that's a very time-dependent process, huh?
It is. It takes time.
Yeah.
But you learn so much in the process.
You really do. I heard a way of describing time recently that I've really taken on board, and there's a difference between time spent and time invested.
Yes.
And I really feel like what you're talking about is time invested rather than time spent. And when we're coming from that track of saying it hasn't worked or it's not working yet, we're thinking about time spent being, I've been here for an hour. I'm not getting an hour's worth back from my horse right now. Whereas it's the investment that's cumulative, and we sometimes don't get the dividend of that till a little bit later down the line.
Yeah. And that was really the big question when we were filming Pura Vida, is that we had no idea if 2 weeks would be enough. The trek across the country took 2 weeks. And the hypothesis was that because we were traveling together, we wouldn't need as much time as if we were staying in one location.
Yeah.
And yet we had no way of knowing if that was true or not. And I actually, as you saw in the movie, I have a huge meltdown on day 3 when I'm pretty sure it's all going to go terribly and we've set up this whole thing for failure.
I felt for you at that moment. I felt for you. It's a thing, for us watching the movie in its entirety where it comes to a conclusion. That's very different to being in the situation where you're making it, but there is no defined ending.
No,
this is like all no defined it's an ending. Open question. Yeah.
Yeah. And, we had film crew and support crew and we had people hiking across the country. And I thought, what if this whole thing doesn't work? What if the horses hate us just as much at the end as they did at the beginning? And it was really an adventure emotionally as well as physically.
Yeah. You go through the glass ceiling more than once, huh, when you go on those trips. It's really, really, adventure in its purest form.
Yeah.
I love it. So if people are interested in working with you and finding out more, we've mentioned the webinar, which I will link to in the show notes, but tell us all the places where they can find you.
The easiest place to go is tamingwilds.com. It's the website, and it'll give you the links to everything else. I am also on Facebook, Elsa Sinclair, and then Taming Wild Movie is the business page, and I post everything on both pages. I'm also on Patreon. So in my Patreon group, I post video film that was released in December but we actually are filming the third film right now, which is still in the middle of filming. And
I
I
didn't
release
know
a
that.
video. Yes. So I release a video every week about the process of filming this third movie, Taming Wild Evolution.
I'm behind on the
So yeah, between the
times.
webs. Moving on, got to keep up.
Yeah. Keep the pace. Keep the pace.
That's right.
I will say that I'm a member of your Patreon group, and there are a number of tiers that you can join at, which make it super affordable for anyone interested in learning more about your work. And the amount of content that you share with us in there is incredible. So thank you for your generosity. It's really worth jumping on board with if you are keen to learn more about what it is that you do.
Absolutely. Freedom-based training is fairly unique in the horse world, and I would love to make it available to everybody at no cost.
Mm-hmm.
So I try and keep things like the Patreon group really, really reasonable so anybody can join. It's a little bit more expensive if you want to work with me one-on-one because there's only one of me,
Mm-hmm.
but it's really a fascinating process, and ultimately it's the horses that are the teachers. I think of myself as more of a translator than a teacher.
Yeah.
And if I can keep working on the translation so that people learn to read their own horses better and learn from their own horses, that's my goal.
Yeah. And the movie that we've been talking about, Pura Vida, I'm still not saying it right. I was reluctant to say it then, but I thought, well, I can't not mention the title. Can people buy that? They can stream it off Vimeo. So it's sold through Vimeo, isn't it? But purchased through your site, tamingwild.com.
So tamingwild.com has all the links. It is on Vimeo on demand. And so the easiest way to find that is through the tamingwild.com website. But you can probably search Vimeo as well.
Perfect.
And then, of course, we have discs as well. And our amazing composer, Cora Rose, has recently gotten us a CD of the soundtrack as well. So
that's
the soundtrack's
really
also
cool. The music's beautiful.
Yeah, it's the same composer as did the music for the first film. But the first film, we were working quite on a budget, and we used music she had already written. And the second film, we dove in a little deeper, and she wrote the music specifically for the film.
Oh, it's perfect. It really fits beautifully together. What a glorious team you all are. There's all these various facets that go into making these projects, isn't there? And it's such an involved thing behind the scenes to put something like this together.
It is. I'm a horse trainer first and foremost. I sort of stumbled into the movie making side of it, but I have been blessed with incredible people helping me out. My partner, Kevin Smith, he helps me with every facet of the documentary making. And, we hired the most incredible film guy who trekked the entire track with us across Costa Rica in Pura Vida. So everything you see in that movie, he's walking backwards through the mud filming.
I hear you. I'm married to a documentary filmmaker as well. And often when I see the product of his work, I think, you were walking backwards through that, or you're climbing down that cliff, but with a camera.
Yes. It's quite amazing when you think about it. And
it really is.
This is my first adventure film. So it really was eye-opening to me, all the things that we had to sort out and problem solve for and organize around. While at the same time training the horses and doing the journey.
Yeah, it's really wonderful. And what a great format. I just thought of that now, like in terms of like producing the movie, which is sort of the embodiment of the work that you're doing, but all the way towards it and during it and afterwards, there's like a continuation of that process. It's just this lovely point of focus that offers it to the world in this very contained way.
There's always going to be a microcosm and a macrocosm of perspective. And, this work is as deep and intricate as you want it to be, but it also, you can pull back and see it as a bigger, wider lens where you sort of see the whole picture overview. And that's what the movies are, is they're sort of the wider lens, the whole picture overview.
Yeah.
And then when people want to know more, they just have to come find me at tamingwild.com and drop me an email and find out how to dive in a little deeper if they want more details.
Yeah. Well, I, for one, am very grateful for finding you. Thank you, Elsa, for all the work you do and for what you bring to the world. It's enriched my life and my horses' lives no end.
I'm so glad, Jane. I'm so glad I got to meet you too. You know, our world is getting bigger thanks to our global internet connections.
Isn't it? Thank whoever the person was that made the internet.
No
Where would we
kidding.
be without it? Thank you so much, Elsa. I'll put all of the links that you've mentioned in the show notes as well for anyone needing to click directly.
Wonderful. Sounds good.
Thank you again for hanging out with us, and thank you to Elsa for sharing all of her awesomeness so freely. If you want to find out more about Elsa or connect up with her, you can do so by visiting tamingwild.com. You can purchase both of her movies there, find out about her magnificent online course, and various other bits and pieces. To join her Patreon group, which I highly recommend, jump on patreon.com/tamingwild. And as mentioned, I will put all the links up in the show notes on my website. If it's me you want to connect up with, let's make it happen. You can find me at confidentwriter.online. I would love to hear from you. Have a great day, and I look forward to chatting with you again in the next episode.